In Tahrir Square, they celebrated the victory handed to them when Egypt's military took control on Friday.
Finally, we get our freedom!
But are they really home free? Or is this just a lull before the next Mubarak strong-arms his way into power? Is the military capable of steering the ship to a real democracy?
That is the biggest question in Egypt right now.
Stephen Cook is an expert on Egypt's military at the Council on Foreign Relations.
History suggests otherwise, but there are millions of people in the streets of Egypt demanding that.
In its 5,000-year history, from the pharaohs right up to the present, Egypt has had one authoritarian ruler, conqueror, oppressor after another. The Assyrians, the Persians, Alexander the Great, the Romans, Napoleon.
The Ottomans, the French, the British.
In 1919, the Egyptians rose up in protest, even women, just as we've seen these last 3 weeks. And for the briefest of periods, the country inched toward democracy.
It wasn't entirely as we would describe a Western democracy.
Princeton professor Daniel Kurtzer is a former U.S. ambassador to Egypt.
But there were political parties and there was a debate. It was under the tutelage of a king.
The experiment lasted 30 years, until King Farouk, more interested in his lavish lifestyle than in governing, was overthrown in a military coup.
In Egypt, exiled King Farouk's famed Kuba Palace is open to the newsreel camera, revealing scenes of fantastic luxury and garishness.
As the Farouk dynasty came to an end in 1952, the military took over and was seen in the first instance as a new form of legitimizing power in Egypt, welcomed very heartily by the masses.
Sound familiar? Gamal Abdel Nasser, one of the coup leaders, came to power in 1954 and established what became an autocratic military dynasty. All of Egypt's presidents have been military officers. Their legacy, stability, but at a high price. When Nasser died in 1970, his successor, Anwar al-Sadat, won the Nobel Prize for making peace with Israel, but resorted to repression at home to crush political turmoil.
Sadat saluted as the various units passed in review.
Sadat was assassinated in 1981. The man at his side that day was Hosni Mubarak, who immediately imposed a state of emergency, which is still in effect.
One would have thought that Mubarak would have learned a lesson. When he entered power, he was seen as a modest man, but over time, the same authoritarian tendencies grew within him.
Although the soldiers in Tahrir Square, conscripts, tended to sympathize with the demonstrators, members of Egypt's military elite have a remarkable and lucrative interest in holding on to power, even as they say they'll relinquish it.
They control an empire of firms and businesses that do everything from bottle spring water to build kitchen appliances, tourism. They operate resorts. This is a big conglomerate.
Cleanup is underway in Tahrir Square now. But of course, it could become Revolution Square all over again if Egyptians aren't satisfied that genuine democracy is coming.
The diehards in Tahrir Square, when everybody sobers up after this wild celebration with Mubarak leaving power, will be very concerned and quite distrustful of a military establishment that has been in bed with Mubarak and has a vested interest in the status quo, in particular the economic status quo of the country.
Because these people have their own vested interest in the 18-day uprising that could turn out to be a true revolution, 5,000 years in the making.
This is Elizabeth Palmer. It's spreading. Fired up by Egypt's revolution, protesters heavily outnumbered by riot police marched through Algeria's capital on Saturday to demand democratic reforms. And in Yemen, too, police beat demonstrators calling for the ouster of their president.
What we want is to demand the rights of all the people and overthrow the regime. The president must leave, just like Hosni Mubarak and the Tunisian president.
The Middle East was the exception. Nothing ever seemed to change there. Well, change has now come to the Middle East. It will never be the same again.
That's the hope of reformers and the fear of repressive governments all over the region, according to Martin Indyk of the Brookings Institution.
In places like Yemen, potentially in Jordan, Algeria, there you have leaders who do not have the legitimacy that grows out of a free and fair election, and who have systematically, in one way or another, failed to meet the needs of their people. And so that's the combination that has to be very worrying to those leaders.
Not only to them, but also to the leaders of Western governments, especially the United States, allied with Israel. Hosni Mubarak's police state was on the U.S. side too, keeping peace with Israel for 30 years. But free and fair elections in Egypt could change the whole equation, says John Alterman of the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
I think it is likely that a more democratic Middle East will be a Middle East where more Islamic voices are heard in politics. And Islamic voices in politics talk about being more hostile toward Israel and cooperating less with the United States.
I sat down with Dr. Rashad Al-Bayoumi, Deputy Director of the Muslim Brotherhood, which for the moment anyway says it does want to keep peace with all of Egypt's neighbors.
Will you protect or work to protect peace with Israel?
Yes, we will preserve the peace with Israel, he says, but only if they give up the tragedies that they are perpetrating against the Palestinians. Egypt's interim rulers, too, say they will respect the 1979 peace accord with Israel, something that comes as a relief to Israel's government. Spokesman Mark Regev.
Israel welcomes the statement from Egypt that the military government intends to honor the peace treaty.
That's for now. But politics in Egypt are going to move fast as factions battle for power in the political space wrenched open by these protests.
The dust hasn't begun to settle. And how that dust settles will partly determine whether this is an inspiration to people or a cautionary tale.
This uprising was powered by the youth who had peaceful, even noble goals. But in the words of Thomas Jefferson, the generation that commences a revolution can rarely complete it. And that, in the case of Egypt, is the danger.